Hey, 5A. All right, time to carry on with the next chapter of Howl's Moving Castle. You might remember in the last one that Sophie had met with Miss Pentstemon, Howl's old teacher, and found out that she was a witch, and there was something going on with this in the relationship between Howl and Calcifer. Anyway, chapter 13, in which Sophie blackens Howl's name. Sophie was feeling decidedly queer again when they reached the palace. Its many golden domes dazzled her. The way to the front entrance was up a huge flight of steps with a soldier in scarlet standing every 6 steps. The poor boys must have been near fainting in this heat, Sophie thought as she puffed her way dizzily past them. At the top of the steps were archways, halls, corridors, lobbies, one after another. Sophie lost count of how many. At every archway, a splendidly dressed person wearing white gloves, still somehow white in spite of the heat, inquired their business and then led them on to the next personage in the next archway. "Mrs. Pendragon to see the king," the voice of each echoed down the halls. About halfway, Howl was politely detached and told to wait. Michael and Sophie went on being handed from person to person. They were taken upstairs, after which the splendid persons were dressed in blue instead of red, and handed on again until they came to an anteroom, panelled in 100 different coloured woods. There Michael was peeled off and made to wait too. Sophie, who by this time was not at all sure whether she was having some strange dream, was ushered through huge double doors. This time the echoing voice said, "Your Majesty? Here is Mrs. Pendragon to see you." And there was the king. Not on a throne, but sitting in a rather square chair with only a little gold leaf on it, near the middle of a large room, but dressed much more modestly than the persons who waited on him. He was quite alone, like an ordinary person. True, he sat with one leg thrust out in a kingly sort of manner, and he was handsome in a plump, slightly vague way. But to Sophie he seemed quite youthful, and just a touch too proud of being a king. She felt he ought, with that face, to have been more unsure of himself. He said, "Well, what does Wizard's Howl's mother want to see me about?" And Sophie was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact she was standing there talking to the king. It was, she thought dizzily, as if the man sitting there with the huge important thing, which was kingship, were 2 separate things that just happened to occupy the same chair. And she found she'd forgotten every word of the careful, delicate things Howl had told her to say. But she had to say something. "He sent me to tell you he's not going to look for your brother," she said. "Your Majesty." She stared at the king. The king stared back. It was a disaster. "Are you sure?" asked the king. "The wizard seemed quite willing when I talked to him." The one thing Sophie had left in her head is that she was here to blacken Howl's name. So she said, He lied about that. He didn't want to annoy you. He's a slitherer outer, if you see what I mean, Your Majesty." "And he hopes to slither out of finding my brother Justin," said the king. "I see. Won't you sit down, since I see you are not young, and tell me the wizard's reasons?" There was another plain chair rather a long way from the king. Sophie creaked herself down into it and sat with her hands propped on her stick like Mrs. Pentstemon, hoping that would make her feel better. But her mind was still simply a roaring white blank of stage fright. All she could think of to say was, "Only a coward would send his old mother along to plead for him. You can see what he's just from that, Your Majesty." "It is an unusual step," the king said gravely. "But I told him I'd make it worth his while if he agreed." "Oh, he doesn't care about money," Sophie said. "But he's scared stiff of the Witch of the Waste, you see. She put a curse on him, and it's just caught up with him." Then he has every reason to be scared," said the king with a slight shiver. "But tell me more, please. What about the wizard?" "More about Howl?" Sophie thought desperately, "I have to blacken his name. Her mind was such a blank for a second, it actually seemed to her that Howl had no faults at all. How stupid. Well, he's fickle, careless, selfish and hysterical, she said. Half the time, I don't think he cares what happens to anyone as long as he's all right. But then I find out how awfully kind he's been to some people. And then I think he's kind just when it suits him. Only then I find out he undercharges poor people. I don't know, Your Majesty, he's a mess. My impression, said the king, was that Howl is an unprincipled, slippery rogue with a glib tongue and a clever mind. Would you agree? How well you put it, Sophie said heartily. But you left out how vain he is, and she looked suspiciously at the king across the yards of carpet. He seemed so surprisingly ready to help her blacken Howl's name. The king was smiling. It was that slightly uncertain smile that went with the person he was, rather than the king he ought to be. Thank you, Miss Pendragon, he said. Your outspokenness has taken a great weight off my mind. The wizard agreed to look for my brother so readily, I thought I'd picked the wrong man after all. I feared he was someone who was either unable to resist showing off or would do anything for money. But you've shown me he is just the man I need. Oh, confound it, Sophie cried out. He sent me to tell you he wasn't. And so you did. The king hitched his chair an inch towards Sophie's. Let me be equally outspoken now, he said. Mrs. Pendragon, I need my brother back badly. It's not just that I'm fond of him and I regret the quarrel we had. It's not even that certain people are whispering that I did away with him myself, which anyone who knows us both knows to be perfect nonsense. No, Mrs. Pendragon. The fact is, my brother Justin is a brilliant general, and with High Norland and Strangier about to declare war on us, I can't do without him. The witch has threatened me too, you know. Now, all reports agree that Justin did indeed go to the waste. I'm certain the witch meant me to be without him when I needed him most. I think she took Wizard Solomon as bait to fetch Justin. And it follows now that I need a fairly clever and unscrupulous wizard to get him back. Howl will just run away, Sophie warned the king. No, said the king, I don't think he will. The fact he sent you tells me that. He did it to show me he was too much of a coward to care what I thought of him. Isn't that right, Mrs. Pendragon? Sophie nodded. She wished she could have remembered all Howl's delicate remarks. The king would have understood them even if she did not. Not the act of a vain man, the king said. But no one would do that except as a last resort, which shows me Wizard Howl will do what I want if I make clear to him his last resort has failed. I think you might be taking delicate hints that aren't there, Your Majesty, Sophie said. I think not, the king smiled. His slightly vague features had all firmed up. He was sure he was right. Tell Wizard Howl, Mrs. Pendragon, I am appointing him Royal Wizard as from now, with our royal command to find Prince Justin alive or dead before the year is out. You have our leave to go now. He held out his hand to Sophie, just like Mrs. Pentstemon, but a little less royally. Sophie levered herself up, wondering if she was meant to kiss the hand or not. But since she felt more like raising her stick and beating the king over the head with it, she shook the king's hand and gave a creaking little curtsy. It seemed to be the right thing to do. The king gave her a friendly smile as she hobbled away towards the double doors. Oh, curses, she muttered to herself. It was not only exactly what Howl did not want. Howl would now move the castle 1,000 miles away. Letty, Marta and Michael would all be miserable, and no doubt there would be torrents of green slime into the bargain as well. Comes from being the eldest, she muttered while she was shoving the heavy doors open. You just can't win. And here was another thing which had gone wrong. In her annoyance and disappointment, Sophie had somehow come out through the wrong set of double doors. This anteroom had mirrors all around it, and in them she could see her own little bent, hobbling shape in its fine grey dress, a great many people in blue court dress, others in suits as fine as Howl's, but no Michael. Michael, of course, was hanging around in the anteroom, panelled in 100 different kinds of wood. "Oh, drat," said Sophie. One of the courtiers hastened up to her and bowed. "Madam Sorceress, can I be of assistance?" He was an undersized young man with rather red eyes. Sophie stared at him. "Oh, good gracious," she said, "so the spell worked." "It did indeed," said the small courtier, a little ruefully. "I disarmed him while he was sneezing, and now he's suing me. But the important thing," and he felt his face spread into a happy smile, "is that my dear Jane has come back to me. Now, what can I do for you? I feel responsible for your happiness." "I'm not sure it mightn't be the other way round," Sophie said. "Are you by any chance the Count of Cataract?" "At your service," said the small courtier, bowing. "Jane Farrier must be a good foot taller than he is," Sophie thought. "It's definitely all my fault." "Yes, you can help me," she said, and explained about Michael. The Count of Cataract assured her Michael would be fetched and brought down to the entrance hall to meet her. It was no trouble at all. He took Sophie to a gloved attendant himself and handed her over with much bowing and smiling. Sophie was handed to another attendant and then another, just as before, and eventually hobbled her way down to the stairs guarded by the soldiers. Michael was not there. Neither was Howl, but that was a small relief to Sophie. She thought she might have guessed it would be like this. The Count of Cataract was obviously a person who never got a thing right, and she was another herself. It was probably lucky she hadn't even found the way out. By now she was so tired and hot and dejected, she decided not to wait for Michael. She wanted to sit down in the fireside chair and tell Calcifer the mess she'd made of things. She hobbled down the grand staircase, she hobbled round a grand avenue, she stumped along another where spires and towers and gilded roofs circled round in giddy profusion. And she realised it was worse than she thought. She was lost. She had absolutely no idea how to find the disguised stable where the castle entrance was. She turned up another handsome thoroughfare at random, but didn't recognise that either. By now she didn't even know the way back to the palace. She tried asking random people she met. Most of them seemed as hot and tired as she was. "Wizard Pendragon," they said. "Who's he?" Sophie hobbled on helplessly. She was near giving up and sitting on the next doorstep for the night when she passed the end of the narrow street where Mrs. Pentstemmen's house was. "Ah," she thought, "I can go and ask the footman. He and Howl were so friendly, he must know where Howl lives." So she turned down the street. The Witch of the Waste was coming up it towards her. How Sophie recognised the witch would be hard to say. Her face was different. Her hair, instead of being orderly chestnut curls, was a rippling mass of red hanging almost to her waist, and she was dressed in floating flutters of auburn and pale yellow. Very cool and lovely she looked. Sophie knew her at once. Sorry, I've lost my place. She almost stopped, but not quite. There's no reason she should remember me, Sophie thought. I must be just one of hundreds of people she's enchanted. And Sophie stumped boldly on, thumping her stick on the cobbles and reminding herself, in case of trouble, that Mrs. Pentstemmen said the same stick had become a powerful object. That was another mistake. The witch came floating up the street, smiling, twirling her parasol, followed by two sulky-looking page boys in orange velvet. When she came level with Sophie, she stopped and tawny perfume filled Sophie's nose. "Why, it's Miss Hatter," the witch said, laughing. "I never forget a face, especially if I've made it myself. What are you doing here, dressed up so fine? If you're thinking of calling on that Mrs. Pentstemmen, you can save yourself the trouble. The old biddy's dead." "Dead?" said Sophie. She had a silly impulse to add, "But she was alive an hour ago." And then she stopped herself, because death is like that. People are alive until they die. "Yes, dead," said the witch. "She refused to tell me where someone was that I wanted to find. She said, 'Over my dead body.' So I took her at her word." She's looking for Howl, Sophie thought. Now what do I do? If she hadn't been so very hot and tired, Sophie would almost be too scared to think. For a witch who could kill Mrs. Pentstemon would have no trouble with Sophie, stick or no stick. And if she suspected for a moment that Sophie knew where Howl was, that could be the end of Sophie. Perhaps it was just as well Sophie couldn't remember where the castle entrance was. I don't know who this person is you've killed, she said, but that makes you a wicked murderess. But the witch did seem to suspect anyway. She said, but I thought you were going to call on Miss Pentstemon. No, said Sophie, it was you said that. I don't have to know her to call you wicked for killing her. Then where were you going? Said the witch. Sophie was tempted to tell the witch to mind her own business, but that was asking for trouble. So she said the only other thing she could think of. I'm going to see the king, she said. The witch laughed disbelievingly. But will the king see you? Yes, of course, Sophie declared, trembling with terror and anger. I made an appointment. I'm going to petition him for better conditions for hatters. I keep going, you see, even after what you did to me. Well, then you're going in the wrong direction, said the witch. The palace is behind you. Oh, is it? She didn't have to pretend to be surprised. Then I must have got turned around. I've been a little vague about directions since you made me like this. The witch laughed heartily and did not believe a word of it. Then come with me, she said, and I'll show you the way to the palace. There seemed nothing Sophie could do but turn around and stump beside the witch with the two page boys trudging sullenly behind them. Anger and hopelessness settled over Sophie. She looked at the witch, floating gracefully beside her, and remembered Mrs. Pentstemon had said the witch was an old woman, really. It's not fair, Sophie thought, but there was nothing she could do about it. Why did you make me like this? She demanded as they went up a grand thoroughfare with a fountain on top of it. You were preventing me from getting some information I needed, the witch says. I got it in the end, of course. Sophie was quite mystified by this. She wondered if it would do any good to say there must be some mistake when the witch added, though I dare say you had no idea you were, and laughed as if that was the funniest part of it. Have you heard of a land called Wales? She asked. No, said Sophie. Is it under the sea? The witch found this funnier than ever. Not at the moment, she said. It's where Wizard Howl comes from. You know Wizard Howl, don't you? Only by hearsay, Sophie lied. He eats girls. He's as wicked as you. But she felt rather cold. It didn't seem to be due to the fountain they were passing at that moment. Beyond the fountain, across a pink marble plaza were the stone stairs with the palace at the top. There you are, that's the palace, said the witch. Are you sure you can manage all those stairs? None the better for you, said Sophie. Make me young again and I'll run up them, even in this heat. Oh, that wouldn't be half so funny, said the witch. Up you go. And if you do persuade the king to see you, remind him that his grandfather sent me to the waste, and I bear him a grudge for that. Sophie looked hopelessly up the long flight of stairs. At least there was nobody but soldiers on them. With the luck she was having today, it wouldn't surprise her to find Michael and Howl on their way down. Since the witch was obviously going to stand there and make sure she went up, Sophie had no choice but to climb them. Up she hobbled, past the sweating soldiers, all the way to the palace entrance again, hating the witch more with every step. She turned round, panting at the top. The witch was still there, a floating russet shape at her foot, with two small orange figures beside her, waiting to see her thrown out of the palace. Drat her, Sophie said. She hobbled over to the guards at the archway. Her bad luck held still. There was still no sign of Michael or Howl in the reaches beyond. She was forced to say to the guards, "There was something I forgot to tell the king." They remembered her. They let her inside to be received by a personage in white gloves, and before Sophie had collected her wits, the palace machinery was in motion again, and she was being handed from person to person just like the first time, until she arrived at the same double doors and the same person in blue was announcing, "Mrs. Pendragon to see you again, Your Majesty." It was like a bad dream. Sophie thought as she went into the same large room. She seemed to have no choice but to blacken Howl's name again. The trouble was, with everything that had happened, and stage fright again into the bargain, her mind was blanker than ever. The king, this time, was standing at a large desk in one corner, rather anxiously moving flags about on a map. He looked up and said pleasantly, "They tell me there was something you forgot to say." "Yes," said Sophie. "Howl said he'll only look for Prince Justin if you promise him your daughter's hand in marriage." "What put that in my head?" she thought. "He'll have us both executed." The king gave her a very concerned look. "Mrs. Pendragon, you must know that is out of the question," he said. "I can see you must be very worried about your son to suggest it, but you can't keep him tied to your apron strings forever, you know. And my mind is made up. Please come and sit in this chair. You seem tired." Sophie tottered to the low chair the king pointed to and sank in it, wondering when the guards would arrive to arrest her. The king looked vaguely around. "My daughter was here just now," he said. To Sophie's considerable surprise, he bent down and looked under the desk. "Valeria," he called. "Valley, come on out. This way, there's a good girl." There was a shuffling noise. After a second, Princess Valeria shunted herself out from under the desk, grinning benignly. She had 4 teeth, but she wasn't old enough to have grown a proper head of hair. All she had was a ring of wispy whiteness above her ears. When she saw Sophie, she grinned wider yet and reached out the hand she'd just been sucking and took hold of Sophie's dress. Sophie's dress responded with a spreading wet stain as the princess hauled herself to her feet on it. Staring up into Sophie's face, Valeria addressed a friendly mark to her in what was clearly a private foreign language. "Oh," said Sophie, feeling an awful fool. "I understand how a parent feels, Mrs. Pendragon," said the king. Oh dear. Okay, more next time.